The early morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse as Sarah Bennett adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her leather briefcase. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. Sarah hadn't planned to be in traffic court that Monday morning. Her research on racial disparities in the justice system usually kept her in libraries and behind computer screens, analyzing data and patterns. But something about the recent surge in complaints about discriminatory traffic citations had drawn her from her comfortable office to these hard wooden benches. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Security guards nodded at familiar faces. Clerks shuffled papers, and nervous defendants whispered to their lawyers. Sarah observed it all with keen eyes, her notepad ready on her lap. Her pen moved swiftly, documenting the subtle interactions. How some people were greeted with smiles, while others received curt nods. How certain defendants were interrupted, while others were allowed to speak at length. She wasn't just any observer, though few in the room knew it. As one of Georgetown's most respected professors, Sarah had shaped the minds of countless legal professionals, including judges who now presided in these very courts. Her articles on judicial bias were required reading in law schools across the country, and her expert testimony had influenced several landmark cases on racial discrimination. Today, however, she sat quietly in the back row, dressed simply in her blazer and pencil skirt, looking like any other professional who might have received a traffic citation. Her own citation for an alleged parking violation on K Street rested in her briefcase. She had considered simply paying the fine online, but something about the circumstances, the unclear signage, the officer's dismissive attitude, had prompted her to contest it. The room gradually filled with more people, young and old, professionally dressed and casual, representing the full spectrum of Washington's diverse population. Sarah noticed how people naturally segregated themselves, creating invisible but unmistakable lines of division. Her trained eye caught the subtleties. Anxiety manifested differently across faces. Some showed defiance, others resignation, and a few displayed the confident ease of those familiar with the system. At precisely 9 a.m., the BFF's voice rang out, commanding everyone to rise. Sarah stood with the others, her posture straight but relaxed. She watched as Judge Michael Harrison entered the courtroom, his black robes flowing behind him. His reputation preceded him, known for being particularly strict with traffic violations, especially in cases involving minority defendants. What the young judge couldn't know was that among those he would pass judgment on today sat the very professor who had not only taught him constitutional law, but had also written one of his recommendations for judicial appointment. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she observed his confident stride to the bench. She remembered him as an eager student, always first to raise his hand, passionate about justice but sometimes blind to his own preconceptions. As the proceedings began and cases were called one by one, Sarah continued her careful observations, documenting each interaction, each decision, each subtle shift in tone. She knew that sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice came not from textbooks or lectures, but from real-life experiences that forced people to confront their own biases. Little did anyone in that courtroom know that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become an extraordinary lesson in justice, humility, and the persistent challenge of unconscious bias in the American legal system. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's docket with practiced efficiency. At 35, he was one of the youngest judges appointed to the D.C. Traffic Court, and he took immense pride in maintaining strict order in his courtroom. The morning sunlight cast shadows across the polished mahogany of his desk as he sipped his black coffee. His clerk had arranged the day's cases in neat stacks. Parking violations, speeding tickets, and other infractions that most of his colleagues considered mundane. But Harrison saw each case as an opportunity to uphold the law, no matter how small the violation. His reputation for being particularly strict preceded him through the courthouse hallways. Defense attorneys warned their clients about his no-nonsense approach, and even veteran lawyers straightened their ties a little tighter before entering his courtroom. Some whispered that he was trying to prove himself due to his youth, while others suggested he was building a record for higher judicial appointments. Today's docket looked typical. 27 cases, mostly traffic violations. Harrison skimmed through them, making mental notes. His eyes paused briefly on a parking citation issued on K Street, noting the defense name, Sarah Bennett. Something about the name tickled at his memory, but he dismissed it. After handling thousands of cases, names often seemed vaguely familiar. As he donned his black robes, Harrison recalled his law school days at Georgetown. Those halls had shaped him, molded his understanding of justice and law. He remembered passionate discussions about constitutional rights, about fairness and equality. Yet here, in traffic court, he had found his own interpretation of justice, swift, strict, and unwavering. The bailiff knocked on his door, signaling it was time. Harrison gathered his papers, straightened his spine, and took a deep breath. In the mirror, he checked his reflection. Young face set in serious lines, dark hair neatly combed, robes perfectly arranged, the image of judicial authority he had worked so hard to cultivate. Walking through the private corridor to his courtroom, Harrison reviewed his personal rules. Maintain control, show no favoritism, and always uphold the letter of the law. These principles had served him well in his first year on the bench, earning him respect, if not popularity. His mind briefly wandered to his old constitutional law professor, whose lessons about justice and equality had once seemed so clear. Now, in the daily grind of traffic court, justice seemed simpler, black and white, guilty or not guilty, pay the fine or face the consequences. The bailiff stood ready at the courtroom door. Harrison could hear the familiar shuffle of people rising on the other side. In moments he would assume his position of authority, ready to dispense justice as he saw fit, unaware that this ordinary Monday would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness and judgment. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, and Judge Harrison entered his domain, his expression stern and confident, completely unaware that among the faces turned toward him was one that would soon remind him of lessons he had long since forgotten along his path to the bench. The morning proceeded with Judge Harrison's usual efficiency until case number 47 was announced. Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street. The clerk called out, her voice echoing through the crowded courtroom. Sarah rose gracefully from her seat, her movements deliberate and dignified as she approached the podium. Several attorneys present noticed something different about her demeanor. She carried herself not with the typical nervousness of a defendant, but with the confident bearing of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers. His voice carried the same stern tone he used all morning. "Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during rush hour. How do you plead?" Sarah's voice was clear and measured as she responded, "Not guilty, Your Honor." She began to explain about the obscured signage and confusing parking regulations, but Harrison cut her off mid-sentence, something he'd been doing frequently with defendants that morning. "Miss Bennett," he interrupted, his tone growing notably impatient. "The officer's report clearly states that you were parked in a clearly marked restricted zone between 4 and 6 p.m. Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect?" Several observers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone. A few regular attorneys exchanged glances, noting how the judge's interruption seemed particularly abrupt this time. Sarah, however, remained unruffled. "Your Honor, if I may," she continued with practiced calm, "I have photographs showing that the sign in question was partially covered by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach. Judge Harrison's expression hardened. He'd heard every excuse in the book, and this one seemed no different. Miss Bennett, this court's time is valuable. The officer's report indicates no such obstruction. As Sarah attempted to retrieve the photographs from her briefcase, Harrison waved his hand dismissively. That won't be necessary. The burden of knowing and following parking regulations falls on the driver, not the city. The exchange continued, with Sarah maintaining her composed demeanor while Judge Harrison grew increasingly stern. His responses became shorter, his tone more clipped. To the regular courthouse observers, it seemed like another case of the young judge asserting his authority. What made this interaction particularly notable was Sarah's unusual calmness in the face of the judge's growing irritation. She stood straight, maintained eye contact, and responded to each dismissal with the practiced patience of someone who had spent years teaching others about the very principles of justice being demonstrated in this moment. The tension in the courtroom built as the exchange continued, with even the bailiff shifting uncomfortably at his post. The other defendants, waiting their turn, watched with growing interest, sensing that something about this case was different from the routine traffic violations they had witnessed all morning. Little did Judge Harrison know that his next decision would transform this seemingly routine traffic case into a moment that would challenge his entire approach to justice. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his decision already formed. Before Sarah could finish her final statement, the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his stern features as he delivered his verdict. Miss Bennett, this court finds you guilty of violating City Parking Code 23.4, he announced, his voice carrying a note of finality. Given your apparent disregard for clearly posted regulations and your attempts to dispute the officer's professional judgment, I'm setting the fine at $500, well above the standard $100 penalty. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the regular court officers exchanged surprised glances. This was an unusually severe fine for a simple parking violation. Several attorneys present shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the disproportionate nature of the penalty. Sarah stood motionless at the podium, her expression unchanged. She watched as Judge Harrison scribbled the fine amount on her citation, his movements sharp and decisive. The young judge seemed pleased with himself, confident he was sending a clear message about respect for the law. Furthermore, Harrison continued, his tone growing more severe, I want to note for the record that this court takes a dim view of citizens who attempt to circumvent their responsibility by questioning the competence of our law enforcement officers. The court clerk typed furiously, documenting every word. The regular attorneys who frequented this courtroom had never seen such a steep fine for a parking violation. Some began taking notes, sensing this might become relevant in future cases. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm and measured despite the circumstances. Your Honor, I accept the court's decision. She paused, adjusting her glasses deliberately. However, I should mention that this will unfortunately require me to end my constitutional law lecture early this afternoon. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his paperwork, still writing his final notes on the case. Miss Bennett, your scheduling conflicts are not this court's concern. You should have considered your professional obligations before violating city parking ordinances. The courtroom remained unusually quiet, the tension palpable. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases in this court, seemed to sense something significant was about to unfold. The morning sun had reached its peak outside, casting long rectangles of light across the courtroom floor, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. Sarah gathered her materials unhurriedly, every movement deliberate and composed. She showed no signs of the anger or frustration that typically accompanied such a harsh penalty. Instead, there was something in her demeanor, a quiet confidence, that suggested this story was far from over. The next case was already being called. But several eyes remained fixed on Sarah as she made her way back to her seat. Judge Harrison had already moved on, unaware that his next realization would shake the very foundations of his judicial confidence. Sarah's measured voice carried through the courtroom as she added one final comment. I do need to finish grading papers for tomorrow's advanced seminar at Georgetown Law. You remember those deadlines well, don't you, Judge Harrison? From when you were in my constitutional law class 10 years ago. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Judge Harrison's hand froze mid-submission, and his face visibly paled. The revelation hit him like a physical force as memories flooded back. Professor Bennett standing at the front of the lecture hall, challenging students to think deeply about justice, fairness, and unconscious bias. Several attorneys in the gallery audibly gasped. The court clerk's fingers hovered motionless over her keyboard. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, struggled to maintain his professional composure. Judge Harrison slowly looked up, really seeing Sarah Bennett for the first time that morning. She stood there exactly as he remembered her from his law school days. The same authoritative presence, the same questioning gaze that had guided him through complex constitutional principles. The irony was crushing. Professor Bennett, who had written one of his strongest recommendations for judicial appointment, who had praised his understanding of equal justice under law, had just experienced firsthand how far he had strayed from those principles.
Memories rushed back. Her passionate lectures about judicial temperament, her warnings about the subtle ways bias could creep into decision-making, her emphasis on treating every case with equal consideration, regardless of the defendant's background. The young judge's face flushed red with embarrassment. His earlier smugness evaporated as he realized he had just provided a perfect case study in exactly the kind of biased judgment she had taught him to guard against. Sarah remained standing, her expression neither triumphant nor accusatory. She was still the teacher, and this had become an unexpected lesson. Not just for her former student, but for everyone present in the courtroom. The silence stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. Regular court observers would later describe this as the longest pause they had ever witnessed in traffic court. The morning sun continued its journey across the courtroom floor, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage where an extraordinary drama was unfolding. Judge Harrison looked down at the excessive fine he had just imposed, then back at his former professor. In that moment, he was no longer the confident young judge, but once again the law student who had sat eagerly in her classroom, learning about the very principles he had just failed to uphold. Judge Harrison's courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. The weight of recognition pressed heavily on his shoulders as he stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor, who had shaped his early understanding of justice. 10 minutes recess, he announced abruptly, his voice cracking slightly. The gavel's bang echoed through the silent room. Without meeting anyone's eyes, he quickly retreated to his chambers, his black robes billowing behind him. Once inside, Harrison collapsed into his leather chair, loosening his collar. His hands trembled as he pulled out an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, standing proudly with the constitutional law faculty. Memories flooded back. Her passionate lectures about equal justice, her patient guidance during office hours, and most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter sat framed on his wall, its words now seeming to mock him. In his chambers, Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings in his mind. He had interrupted her more quickly than other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount, and he had done it all without once truly looking at her face. The bailiff knocked softly, indicating the recess was nearly over. Harrison stood before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes. The young judge who had prided himself on being strict but fair now looked like exactly what he was. A man who had lost sight of the fundamental principles his professor had worked so hard to instill. Outside his chambers, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Attorneys who regularly appeared before him exchanged knowing looks, wondering how this revelation would change the young judge they had come to know. Sarah remained in her seat, grading papers as if this were just another day in her decades-long career of teaching justice to future legal professionals. Her calm demeanor made the situation even more poignant. She hadn't come seeking confrontation, but rather had allowed the moment to become a teaching opportunity. Harrison took several deep breaths, straightened his robes, and prepared to return to the courtroom. He knew the next few minutes would define not just this case, but potentially his entire judicial career. Judge Harrison returned to his courtroom, his demeanor markedly changed. The confident stride was replaced by a more measured walk, his expression now thoughtful rather than stern. "Professor Bennett," he began, his voice carrying a humility that surprised the regular court attendees. "I owe you and this court an apology. My conduct this morning failed to meet the very standards of justice you taught me a decade ago." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I've allowed my position to blind me to my own biases. Today, you've given all of us, a powerful reminder about the importance of fair and equal treatment under the law." The courtroom remained silent as Harrison picked up Professor Bennett's citation. "I'm rescinding the $500 fine. Furthermore, I'm dismissing this case entirely due to the unclear signage you attempted to bring to the court's attention." Sarah nodded graciously, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Professor Bennett, your lessons about constitutional rights and equal justice weren't just classroom theory. They were principles I swore to uphold. Today, I failed to live up to those principles." He turned to address the entire courtroom.
Let this be a reminder to everyone present, myself especially, that justice must be blind to prejudice, not to reason. Our duty is to hear each case with fresh ears and see each person before us with clear eyes. The regular attorneys exchanged impressed glances. This was unprecedented. A judge publicly acknowledging his bias and correcting his mistake. Several began making notes, recognizing they were witnessing a remarkable moment in the court's history. Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the same educational tone she had used in countless lectures. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. This moment demonstrates why our legal system depends not just on rules, but on the humility and wisdom of those who interpret them." The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. What had started as a routine traffic court session had become a profound lesson in justice, humility, and the ongoing struggle against unconscious bias. The remaining defendants and attorneys watched as Harrison continued the day's proceedings with a noticeably different approach. More patient, more attentive, more balanced in his considerations. 3 months after the courtroom incident, Georgetown Law School's main auditorium was filled to capacity. Judge Michael Harrison stood at the podium alongside Professor Sarah Bennett, addressing a captivated audience of law students and faculty. "What happened that day in traffic court," Harrison explained, "wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was about recognizing how easily our biases can cloud our judgment, even when we believe we're being fair." The case had become a powerful teaching tool at Georgetown Law. Professor Bennett had incorporated it into her curriculum, using it to demonstrate how unconscious bias could manifest even in minor legal proceedings. The story had spread beyond Georgetown, featured in legal journals and judicial training programs across the country. Judge Harrison's courtroom had transformed. Regular attorneys noted the marked difference in his approach. Every case now received careful consideration, regardless of the defendant's appearance or background. His reputation shifted from being known as the strictest judge to being considered one of the most fair-minded on the bench. Professor Bennett had turned the experience into a groundbreaking research paper titled Justice in the Mirror, Examining Judicial Bias in Minor Courts. The paper was already influencing judicial training programs nationwide. Sometimes Professor Bennett addressed the audience,
The most important lessons about justice come from unexpected moments. What matters isn't that we make mistakes, but how we respond when our biases are revealed. The incident sparked a broader conversation within the DC court system. Other judges began examining their own decision-making patterns, leading to new guidelines for handling traffic court cases. Statistical analysis showed a significant reduction in disparate sentencing across demographic groups. As the lecture concluded, a student asked Judge Harrison what he learned most from the experience. He smiled thoughtfully before responding. Justice isn't just about knowing the law. It's about remaining humble enough to recognize our own prejudices and brave enough to correct them. The case had become known as the professor's lesson among law students. A reminder that true justice requires constant self-examination and the courage to admit when we've fallen short of our ideals. The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. Judge Harrison stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor, who had shaped his early understanding of justice. His hands gripped the wooden bench, knuckles turning white. 10 minutes recess, he announced abruptly. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the silent chamber. Without meeting anyone's eyes, he quickly retreated to his chambers, black robes billowing behind him like a storm cloud.
Once inside, Harrison sank into his leather chair. His hands trembled as he pulled an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year. Her kind but challenging eyes stared back at him through time. Memories flooded back like a broken dam. Her passionate lectures about equal justice under the law. Her patient guidance during office hours, when he struggled with complex constitutional concepts, and most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter, now framed on his wall. Its words seemed to mock his recent actions. In the quiet of his chambers, Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings with growing horror. He had interrupted her more quickly than other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount. And he had done it all without once truly looking at her face. The shame burned in his chest as he recalled her lessons about judicial temperament and unconscious bias. How many times had she warned their class about the subtle ways prejudice could creep into decision-making? Now, he had become a perfect case study in everything she had taught them to guard against. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, whispers raced through the gallery. Attorneys who regularly appeared before Harrison exchanged knowing looks. Court officers tried to maintain their professional composure, but even they couldn't help glancing at Professor Bennett with newfound respect. Sarah remained composed, grading papers as if this were just another teachable moment in her decades-long career. Her calm demeanor made the situation even more poignant. She hadn't come seeking confrontation, but rather had allowed the moment to become a powerful lesson in justice and humility. The knock at his chamber door indicated the recess was nearly over. The young judge stood before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes. The stern disciplinarian who had prided himself on being strict, but fair, now looked like exactly what he was. A man who had lost sight of the fundamental principles his professor had worked so hard to instill. As he prepared to return to the courtroom, Harrison knew the next few minutes would define not just this case, but potentially his entire judicial career. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders as he straightened his robes and gathered his courage to face the truth about himself and his actions. He thought about what Professor Bennett would expect of him now. Not excuses or defensiveness, but honest self-reflection and a willingness to correct course. The lessons she had taught him years ago were about to face their greatest test. Not in a classroom discussion, but in real-world application. The next knock on his chamber door was more insistent. The recess was ending, and decisions had to be made. Judge Harrison took one final deep breath,
squaring his shoulders. It was time to prove whether he could live up to the principles Professor Bennett had instilled in him all those years ago.